The story of the colonization of the Americas is one of the most consequential chapters in human history. It is a narrative that spans continents, centuries, and countless lives, both remembered and forgotten. The purpose of this study is to delve into that history, not only to recount what happened, but to understand how and why it happened, who shaped it, and how its reverberations continue to define the modern world. Colonization was not a single event but a long and layered process. It changed entire ecosystems, displaced millions, created new societies, and left deep scars that still affect cultures and politics today. Understanding this process is not just about looking backward, it's also about making sense of the present and how we arrived here. By unpacking the myths and facing the realities, we can come closer to a fuller understanding of this shared past. The colonization of the Americas marks a turning point in global history for several key reasons. First, it inaugurated the first truly global exchange of peoples, plants, animals, diseases, and ideas, a process historians often refer to as the Columbian Exchange. Entire economies were reshaped by the flow of silver, sugar, and slaves across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Empires expanded their reach and redefined the concept of borders and power. Societies on both sides of the Atlantic were profoundly transformed. The Americas, home to a rich tapestry of indigenous civilizations, became the focus of European ambition, greed, and imagination. The contact between European and indigenous worlds, often violent and destructive, set the stage for centuries of struggle over land, identity, and sovereignty. In short, the colonization of the Americas did not merely impact one region, it changed the trajectory of the entire globe. To explore this vast topic, it is important to define some of the key terms that will guide this discussion. Colonization refers broadly to the act of establishing control over foreign territories and peoples, often for the purpose of settlement and economic exploitation. It usually involves the migration of settlers, the imposition of new systems of governance, and often the displacement or destruction of existing populations. Imperialism is closely related but often refers more specifically to the ideological and political drive behind empire building. It's about asserting dominance, claiming resources, and extending influence. While colonization is often a tool or expression of imperialism, it can take different forms. One of these is settler colonialism, a specific type in which foreign populations move into a region and establish a permanent presence, often replacing the indigenous population. Unlike forms of colonialism that exploit a land's resources while leaving its people in place, settler colonialism is about occupying and transforming the land itself, often erasing or marginalizing its original inhabitants. This paper argues that the colonization of the Americas was a complex and dynamic process, driven by a web of motivations, economic, religious, political, and involving a variety of actors, from monarchs and missionaries to traders and soldiers, and crucially, the indigenous peoples themselves. Too often, this history has been simplified or mythologized, reduced to tales of discovery or civilization. But in truth, the colonization of the Americas was not a single narrative of European success. It was a contested and often brutal encounter that left deep and uneven legacies. It is essential to move beyond the myths of noble conquerors, passive natives, or inevitable progress, and examine the actual mechanisms, ideologies, and experiences that shaped the process. By doing so, we can see that colonization was not simply a story of domination, but also one of resistance, adaptation, and survival. This study will unfold in 6 major parts, each aimed at building a comprehensive understanding of how colonization took place and what it meant for the people and places involved. First, we will explore the Americas before European contact, focusing on the richness and diversity of indigenous civilizations, as well as their systems of trade and movement. This will help establish what was already present when European ships arrived on the shores. Next, we will look at the European side of the story. What motivated expansion, how explorers like Columbus made contact, and how early legal and religious justifications were formed. From there, we will move into the actual patterns and practices of colonization, examining how different European powers approached conquest and settlement in various regions of the Americas. This includes not only Spain and Portugal but also France, England, the Netherlands, and others. The fourth section will tackle the myths that have grown around colonization. These include misleading ideas about indigenous peoples, exaggerated notions of European superiority, and even the language we use, like discovery, to talk about these events. Unpacking these myths is key to understanding how colonization has been remembered and misunderstood over time. After that, we will turn to the real consequences of colonization, looking at the demographic collapse caused by disease, the use of forced labor and slavery, the reshaping of environments, and the ways indigenous cultures resisted and endured. Finally, the paper will explore the long-term legacies of colonization. How did it shape political structures, economic inequalities, and national identities? What cultural forms emerged from this collision of worlds? And how do we continue to grapple with this history in the present? Through debates over monuments, textbooks, and reparations. The conclusion will draw together the key arguments and reflections from each part, emphasizing that colonization was not a closed chapter but an ongoing force that continues to shape relationships between peoples and nations. It will revisit the central idea that colonization was both a global process and a human experience, one marked by ambition, cruelty, creativity, and resilience. Understanding this process in all its complexity is not just an academic exercise. It is a necessary step toward building more honest and inclusive histories. This narrative journey through the colonization of the Americas is not only about what happened, but how we tell the story and who gets to tell it. It asks us to reconsider what we think we know and to listen more closely to the voices that have long been left out. It invites reflection not only on the past, but also on the present world that colonization helped create. Long before European ships appeared on the horizons of the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, the Americas were already home to a vast and intricate mosaic of civilizations. These societies were not static or isolated, as some early European narratives would later suggest, but vibrant, diverse, and highly sophisticated. From the towering temples of the Maya to the carefully engineered roadways of the Inca, the pre-Columbian Americas were a land of immense cultural and technological achievement. This chapter explores that world as it existed before colonization, focusing on major indigenous civilizations and the complex networks of trade and migration that connected them. Understanding this world is crucial because it challenges the myth that the Americas were a new world or a blank slate. In reality, they were already deeply peopled and politically complex long before the first Europeans arrived. The Aztec civilization, centered in what is now central Mexico, was one of the most powerful and well-organized empires of the Americas at the time of European contact. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, constructed on an island in Lake Texcoco, was a marvel of urban planning and engineering. At its height, the city was home to perhaps 200,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at the time. The Aztecs built extensive causeways, canals, and aqueducts, demonstrating a mastery of hydraulic infrastructure. Their society was structured around a powerful nobility and priesthood, with the emperor at the top, supported by a complex bureaucracy. Religion played a central role in daily life, and the Aztecs are often remembered for their ritual sacrifices, which were part of a broader cosmology that emphasized balance between the human and divine worlds. Militarily, the Aztecs were expansionist, building an empire through conquest and tribute. Yet they also fostered cultural growth, with advances in astronomy, medicine, and art. To the south, the Inca Empire stretched along the spine of the Andes Mountains, from modern-day Colombia to central Chile. The Inca developed an extraordinary system of roads, over 25,000 miles of them, used to connect distant provinces and facilitate communication, trade, and military movement. Their capital, Cusco, was both a spiritual and administrative center, and its architecture still inspires awe. The Inca managed a centralized economy that was largely based on redistribution. Through a labor tax called the citizens worked on public projects like farming state lands, building infrastructure, or serving in the army. Their knowledge of agriculture was extensive. They used terracing and irrigation to farm in harsh mountain environments and cultivated hundreds of varieties of potatoes and maize. Socially, the Inca placed strong emphasis on collective identity and hierarchy, with the emperor, the Sapa Inca, considered a descendant of the sun god Inti. They had no written language in the traditional sense but used a system of knotted cords known as quipu to record data, a testament to their ingenuity. The Maya civilization predates both the Aztec and Inca in its classical form, reaching its peak between 250 and 900 CE in regions that today include southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. The Maya were not unified under a single empire but consisted of city-states that often engaged in both alliance and warfare. Each city had its own king and ceremonial center, usually featuring towering pyramids, ball courts, and palaces. The Maya were exceptional astronomers and mathematicians, developing a highly accurate calendar system and one of the most sophisticated written scripts in the ancient world. Their glyphic writing recorded dynastic histories, rituals, and mythology on stone stelae and codices made of bark paper. Like the Aztecs, their religion involved a complex pantheon and ritual offerings, though recent research suggests their culture was also deeply philosophical, with an emphasis on cycles of time and cosmic order. In North America, the Mississippian culture flourished in the Mississippi River Valley and its tributaries from about 800 to 1600 CE. Its major center, Cahokia, located near present-day St. Louis, was the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico. At its peak, it may have housed more than 20,000 people. Cahokia was known for its enormous earthen mounds, including Monk's Mound, which remains one of the largest man-made structures in the prehistoric Americas. The Mississippians built complex societies based on maize agriculture and engaged in long-distance trade with regions as far away as the Great Lakes and the Gulf Coast. Their social structure was hierarchical, with powerful chiefs and elaborate ceremonial complexes. Though we know less about their writing and political organization compared to the Maya or Inca, archaeological evidence reveals a rich and organized cultural life. Beyond these major civilizations, the Americas were dotted with hundreds of diverse cultures, each with its own language, customs, and lifeways. The ancestral Puebloans of the American Southwest built intricate cliff dwellings and irrigated farms in arid desert environments. In the Pacific Northwest, societies like the Haida and Tlingit developed complex social hierarchies and artistic traditions centered on the sea. In the Amazon, archaeological discoveries are revealing large pre-Columbian settlements once thought impossible in rainforest environments. Far from being untouched wilderness, the Americas were actively shaped by human hands through agriculture, fire ecology, and settlement patterns. Indigenous peoples were not passive inhabitants of the land but active managers of complex ecosystems. A crucial feature of the pre-colonial Americas was the existence of expansive trade networks that connected distant regions long before the arrival of Europeans. In Mesoamerica, obsidian from central Mexico, jade from the Motagua Valley in present-day Guatemala, and cacao from the lowlands all traveled through exchange networks that spanned hundreds of miles. The Maya and Aztec economies were highly commercialized, with bustling markets where goods, textiles, and food were bought and sold. Currency came in the form of cacao beans, cotton cloth, and copper bells. These exchanges were not merely economic, they were also cultural. They facilitated the spread of ideas, religious practices, and artistic styles across great distances. In the Andes, the Inca state controlled trade through its road system and administrative centers. Unlike in Mesoamerica, the Inca economy did not rely on money or markets in the traditional sense but functioned through a tightly controlled system of tribute and redistribution. Goods such as textiles, ceramics, and dried foods were moved along storage depots and warehouses called calcas, often carried by llamas or human porters. Even beyond the reach of imperial systems, indigenous trade routes crisscrossed the continent. Shells from the coast made their way inland, turquoise traveled south from the American Southwest, and copper was traded from the Great Lakes to the southeastern United States. Migration was also a key part of pre-Columbian history. Populations moved due to environmental change, warfare, or the search for new farmland and resources. Linguistic and genetic studies suggest that these migrations contributed to the incredible diversity of indigenous cultures. Even within regions like the Amazon or the Andes, a multitude of languages and traditions coexisted. In the Arctic, Inuit communities adapted to extreme conditions through technologies like kayaks and snow goggles, while in the tropical lowlands of Central America, communities developed farming systems suited to the rainy, forested terrain. This diversity reminds us that indigenous is not a monolithic category, but a term that encompasses a rich range of experiences and identities. An often debated subject within the study of pre-colonial America is the question of transoceanic contact, whether peoples from Africa, Asia, or Europe reached the Americas before Columbus. While most historians and archaeologists maintain that there is no definitive evidence of sustained or large-scale contact, some fringe theories persist. Claims include Chinese fleets reaching the Pacific coast, Phoenician or Roman voyages crossing the Atlantic, or West African ships visiting the Americas. Though generally unproven and sometimes driven by political or pseudoscientific agendas, these theories reflect an enduring fascination with the idea of who came first. However, it is more valuable to focus on the richness of indigenous history itself than on speculative claims that often obscure rather than clarify the past. That said, the Norse settlements at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, dating to around 1000 CE, do provide documented evidence of pre-Columbian contact between Europe and the Americas. These Norse explorations, led by Leif Erikson and others, were brief and limited in impact. They did not establish lasting colonies, nor did they initiate the kinds of wide-ranging exchanges that Columbus's voyages later triggered. Still, they remind us that the edges of the world were not as isolated as they may seem, and that the story of human movement across oceans is complex and ongoing. In summary, the Americas prior to European contact were not empty lands waiting to be discovered, but continents filled with thriving societies, elaborate political systems, and far-reaching networks of trade and communication. The civilizations of the Aztec, Maya, Inca, Mississippians, and many others demonstrated innovation, resilience, and cultural depth. Their worlds were dynamic and interconnected, laying the foundation for both the catastrophic disruptions and the enduring legacies that would follow in the wake of colonization. To fully grasp the impact of European arrival, we must first appreciate what was already here, a world as ancient and sophisticated as any in the Eastern Hemisphere. As the 15th century drew to a close, Europe was on the cusp of a dramatic transformation. A mixture of economic ambition, religious fervor, and geopolitical rivalry spurred several European powers to turn their attention westward, toward lands yet unknown to them but fully inhabited by millions of indigenous peoples. This new chapter in global history, European expansion into the Americas, did not occur in a vacuum. It was the product of centuries of internal European developments, including the rise of powerful nation-states, technological innovations in navigation, and the increasing centralization of authority under monarchies eager to compete for influence on a global scale. The voyages of discovery and conquest were not just romantic tales of daring exploration, but deeply motivated by tangible interests, wealth, power, and the desire to spread particular worldviews. The results would reshape the world. The most immediate motivation for expansion was economic. European states, particularly Portugal and Spain, were searching for new trade routes to Asia. Since the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the traditional overland routes to the east had become more difficult and costly due to Ottoman control. Spices like pepper, cloves, and cinnamon were highly prized in Europe, and merchants and monarchs alike sought to access these commodities more directly. Maritime trade promised enormous profits, not only in spices but also in gold, silver, and other valuable goods. For monarchs, sponsoring voyages promised a return on investment and the expansion of their treasury. For merchants and navigators, these voyages held the possibility of unimaginable riches. The search for precious metals, particularly gold, became one of the most powerful driving forces behind colonization. The legend of lands rich with gold, El Dorado, the seven cities of Cibola, fueled the imagination of explorers and encouraged state sponsorship. In the case of Spain, the eventual discovery of vast silver deposits in the Americas, especially in Potosí, in modern Bolivia, turned these myths into economic realities. The influx of American silver into the Spanish treasury transformed not only the Spanish economy but also the entire global economic system, tying Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas into an increasingly interconnected web of trade and finance. Religious motivations also played a significant role in European expansion. The Catholic Church, in particular, viewed the spread of Christianity as a divine mission. Following the centuries-long Reconquista in Spain, which ended in 1492 with the fall of Granada, there was a powerful drive to continue spreading Catholicism beyond Europe's borders. Missionary zeal was especially strong among Spanish and Portuguese explorers, many of whom brought along clergy with the specific task of converting indigenous populations. Religious orders such as the Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits would become central players in the colonization process. For these missionaries, colonization was not only a political or economic endeavor but a spiritual one, a crusade to bring salvation to non-Christian souls. This often led to the suppression of indigenous belief systems and practices, and in many cases, to the destruction of cultural heritage in the name of religious purity. At the same time, political and strategic concerns underpinned expansion. European monarchs were in constant competition with one another. The unification of Spain under Ferdinand and Isabella gave rise to a powerful new player on the European stage. Portugal, already a leader in maritime exploration under Prince Henry the Navigator, was rapidly expanding its influence along the coasts of Africa and into the Indian Ocean. France, England, and the Netherlands would soon follow suit, driven by a mixture of envy, ambition, and the need to secure overseas holdings before their rivals could do the same. Colonies were seen as sources of prestige, power, and geopolitical advantage. To possess distant lands was to increase a nation's influence, secure access to resources, and project military power far beyond its borders. Against this backdrop, the voyages of Christopher Columbus stand as one of the most iconic and controversial moments in world history. Sponsored by Spain after being rejected by Portugal and others, Columbus set out in 1492 to find a westward sea route to Asia. Instead, he landed in the Caribbean, encountering islands populated by the Taino and other indigenous peoples. Though Columbus never reached Asia, his voyages opened the door to European colonization of the Americas. He returned to the Americas multiple times, establishing the first European settlements in the New World. His initial contact with indigenous peoples was marked by a mix of curiosity, misunderstanding, and increasing violence. What began as cautious exchanges quickly turned into exploitation and subjugation. Columbus has long been enshrined in Western history as a heroic figure who discovered the New World. However, this narrative has increasingly come under scrutiny. For one, Columbus did not discover a new world in the literal sense. The Americas were already inhabited by millions of people. Nor was he the first non-indigenous person to reach the continent, as Norse explorers had settled briefly in Newfoundland centuries earlier. More importantly, Columbus's governance in the Caribbean was marked by cruelty. Reports by contemporaries, including the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas, detail forced labor, executions, and the use of terror to maintain control. These accounts paint a far more troubling portrait than the traditional storybook image of a brave and visionary explorer. The mythology surrounding Columbus, that he was a peaceful pioneer, that his voyage was the first contact, that he proved the earth was round, obscures the violent and exploitative realities of colonization. In truth, Columbus set a precedent for many of the practices that would define European colonization: the seizure of land, the enslavement of local populations, and the extraction of wealth at any human cost. His voyages mark not the beginning of discovery, but the start of one of the most transformative and traumatic periods in human history. In response to these early voyages and the scramble for land and resources, the Spanish and Portuguese crowns turned to the papacy to mediate their competing claims. The result was the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which effectively divided the non-European world between the two powers. According to the agreement, lands to the west of an imaginary line in the Atlantic would belong to Spain, and those to the east would go to Portugal. This division, which was made without regard for indigenous inhabitants, reflected a Eurocentric worldview in which European powers claimed the right to dispose of lands they had never seen and peoples they had never met. The Treaty of Tordesillas was underpinned by the doctrine of discovery, a legal and theological concept that granted Christian European monarchs the right to claim sovereignty over non-Christian lands. This doctrine, articulated in a series of papal bulls such as Inter Terra, 1493, provided moral and religious justification for conquest. Non-Christian peoples were viewed as subjects to be converted and territories to be brought under the banner of Christendom. While framed as a civilizing mission, this doctrine served as a veneer for imperial ambition, cloaking acts of violence and dispossession in the language of divine mandate. Spanish claims under the treaty led to a flurry of expeditions across the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. These ventures were often justified in legal terms, through the requerimiento, a document read to indigenous peoples demanding they accept Spanish rule and Christianity. If they refused or did not understand, which was common given the language barrier, violence was deemed permissible. These legal fictions gave colonization the appearance of legitimacy while enabling conquest and exploitation on an enormous scale. Portugal, for its part, focused its efforts on Brazil, which fell within its allotted sphere under the treaty. Though initially slow to develop its colonies in the New World, Portugal would later establish a vast plantation economy reliant on enslaved African labor, especially in sugar production. Meanwhile, other European powers soon rejected the treaty's authority, challenging Iberian hegemony and launching their own expeditions. The idea that two monarchies, sanctioned by the Pope, could carve up the world set a precedent that would shape centuries of colonial conflict. In summary, European expansion into the Americas was driven by a volatile mixture of economic desire, religious zeal, and political rivalry. The voyages of Columbus, often mythologized as noble and brave, in fact initiated a process of conquest that would have devastating consequences for indigenous peoples. Legal mechanisms like the Treaty of Tordesillas and the doctrine of discovery provided justification for this expansion, masking the realities of violence, displacement, and enslavement. As we examine the history of colonization, it is essential to move beyond myths and face the complex and often troubling truths that underlie this pivotal period in global history. Only by doing so can we begin to understand the full scope of its impact and legacy. As the 16th and 17th centuries unfolded, the European presence in the Americas evolved from sporadic voyages of exploration into the establishment of vast colonial empires. The early contacts and treaties of the previous period gave way to more aggressive efforts to claim, occupy, and exploit new territories. Patterns of colonization were not uniform, however. They differed widely between European powers in terms of strategies, objectives, treatment of indigenous populations, and long-term structures. From the violent conquests of the Spanish to the trade-focused engagements of the French and the settler colonies of the English, each colonial power carved its own path into the New World. The outcomes of these differing approaches shaped the development of the Americas for centuries to come, and their legacies remain deeply embedded in the political, cultural, and economic systems of the modern world. The Spanish were among the earliest and most aggressive colonizers in the Americas. Their campaign of conquest began with the Caribbean islands and quickly extended to the mainland. The most well-known episodes of Spanish colonization involve the dramatic conquest of the Aztec Empire in 1521 by Hernán Cortés and the fall of the Inca Empire in 1533 at the hands of Francisco Pizarro. These conquests were facilitated by a combination of military force, strategic alliances with rival indigenous groups, the spread of disease, and the psychological impact of unfamiliar European weaponry and horses. The Spanish victories were not inevitable, but once achieved, they opened the floodgates to further expansion. Following these conquests, Spain established a powerful colonial infrastructure across vast regions of the Americas. Central and South America, from Mexico to Peru and beyond, came under Spanish rule. The Crown administered its colonies through a bureaucratic system that included viceroys, governors, and colonial courts, all designed to maintain control and ensure the flow of wealth to the metropole. At the heart of the Spanish colonial system was the encomienda, a labor system in which Spanish settlers were granted rights to indigenous labor in exchange for promises to provide protection and Christian instruction. In practice, this system led to widespread exploitation, brutality, and the decimation of indigenous communities. Though it was later replaced by other systems like the repartimiento, the core dynamic of forced labor and resource extraction persisted. Mining and agriculture became the economic backbone of Spanish America. The silver mines of Potosí in present-day Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico were particularly important. These operations relied on indigenous labor, often coerced through rotational tribute systems adapted from pre-Hispanic practices. The wealth extracted from these regions helped finance Spain's wars in Europe and its sprawling global empire. But it also contributed to inflation and economic challenges back home, a phenomenon known as the price revolution. Urban centers such as Mexico City, Lima, and Bogotá became hubs of colonial administration, commerce, and culture. They were built atop or near the ruins of indigenous cities, symbolizing the imposition of Spanish order. Churches, palaces, and universities rose across the colonies, and Catholicism was vigorously promoted. Indigenous religions and cultural practices were often suppressed, but syncretic forms of worship also emerged, blending native and European elements in creative and enduring ways. In Brazil, the Portuguese established a different model of colonization, though it shared many of the exploitative features of the Spanish system. Initially neglected after its discovery in 1500 by Pedro Álvares Cabral, Brazil became economically significant with the rise of sugar cultivation in the 16th century. The tropical climate and fertile soil along the northeastern coast proved ideal for growing sugarcane, which was in high demand in Europe. To work the plantations, the Portuguese imported large numbers of enslaved Africans, beginning a brutal legacy of racialized slavery that would persist for centuries. Unlike the Spanish, who initially relied heavily on indigenous labor, the Portuguese turned more quickly to African slavery as the foundation of their labor system. Over the course of the colonial period, Brazil would receive more enslaved Africans than any other part of the Americas. The slave trade became integral to the Portuguese economy and shaped Brazilian society in profound ways, embedding a racial hierarchy that persisted long after slavery was formally abolished in 1888. Jesuit missionaries played a prominent role in Portuguese colonization, particularly in the interior of Brazil. They sought to convert indigenous populations and protect them from enslavement, often establishing missions or reductions where native peoples could be gathered, instructed, and monitored. While the Jesuits did offer some protection, their efforts also involved significant cultural assimilation and loss of indigenous autonomy. Eventually, tensions between Jesuit missions and colonial authorities led to the expulsion of the Jesuits in the late 18th century. Though united by a focus on resource extraction and Catholic evangelization, the Spanish and Portuguese colonial models diverged in key respects. The Spanish developed a more centralized bureaucratic administration, while the Portuguese system allowed for greater local autonomy and the prominence of private enterprise, particularly in the form of plantation capitalism. Both empires, however, relied heavily on the exploitation of human and natural resources and left lasting legacies of inequality and environmental degradation. The French, entering the colonial race somewhat later, adopted a different approach that emphasized trade over territorial conquest. In regions such as Canada, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi Valley, French colonists built a network of fur trading posts and allied themselves with various indigenous groups. These alliances were not without tension, but they tended to be more cooperative than the confrontational relationships often seen in Spanish and English colonies. The French worked with groups like the Huron and Algonquin, trading European goods for beaver pelts and other commodities highly valued in European markets. French missionaries, particularly Jesuits, were also active in these regions, seeking to convert indigenous populations. Their approach, however, tended to be more culturally adaptive than that of their Spanish counterparts, at least initially. They often learned native languages and incorporated local customs into their teachings. This facilitated stronger relationships and more sustainable alliances, although it also contributed to the spread of European diseases and cultural change. Unlike Spain and Portugal, France struggled to attract large numbers of settlers to its colonies. Harsh climates, limited economic opportunities, and restrictive immigration policies led to relatively small settler populations in New France. This limited demographic presence partly explains the French emphasis on alliance building and trade rather than direct conquest and settlement. Nevertheless, France did attempt to expand its territorial claims, especially along the Mississippi River, culminating in the establishment of Louisiana. The English, meanwhile, pursued yet another model of colonization, one increasingly focused on permanent settlement and agricultural development. English colonists established some of the first enduring European communities in North America, including Jamestown in 1607 and Plymouth in 1620. Unlike the French, who built extensive trade networks, or the Spanish, who imposed top-down control, the English colonies developed more diverse and decentralized structures. Many English settlers came for religious reasons, such as the Puritans fleeing persecution, while others sought economic opportunities. English colonization was marked by a strong emphasis on land ownership and private property, which frequently brought settlers into conflict with indigenous groups. The desire to expand agricultural lands led to the displacement and violent suppression of native populations. Relations with indigenous peoples varied over time and by region, but were often shaped by competition for resources and deeply rooted beliefs in English cultural and racial superiority. Compared to the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, English settlements were less directly controlled by the crown, at least in their early stages. Many were established by private companies or religious groups under royal charters. Over time, however, the English government increased its oversight, especially as the economic value of the colonies became more apparent. Tobacco in Virginia, rice and indigo in the Carolinas, and other cash crops became central to colonial economies, all reliant on enslaved African labor. The Dutch, though a smaller colonial power, made significant contributions to the colonial landscape of the Americas. Through the Dutch West India Company, the Netherlands established colonies in the Caribbean and North America, most notably New Netherland, with its capital at New Amsterdam, modern-day New York City. The Dutch focus was primarily commercial. They sought to control trade routes and establish profitable enterprises rather than build large settler populations or convert indigenous peoples. Dutch colonies were relatively tolerant and diverse by the standards of the time, attracting settlers from various European backgrounds. The Dutch also engaged in trade with indigenous groups and participated actively in the Atlantic slave trade. Their Caribbean holdings, including islands like Curaçao and Suriname, became important centers of sugar production and slavery. While the Dutch eventually lost many of their North American possessions to the English, their influence endured, especially in the cosmopolitan culture of places like New York. In sum, the colonial patterns established by European powers in the Americas reflected a range of strategies and ideologies. Spain and Portugal focused on conquest and extraction, backed by strong centralized institutions and the Catholic Church. France prioritized trade and alliances, maintaining relatively small settler populations and more flexible approaches to indigenous relations. England leaned toward settler colonialism, emphasizing land ownership and agricultural production, often at the expense of indigenous communities. The Dutch pursued a commercial empire built on trade, slavery, and relatively liberal governance. Despite their differences, all these colonial projects shared a reliance on exploitation of land, labor, and life that defined the colonial experience and continues to shape the Americas to this day. As colonization unfolded across the Americas, it became entangled with a set of persistent myths that not only shaped how Europeans justified their expansion but also influenced centuries of cultural attitudes, political policies, and historical interpretations. These myths served to obscure the violent realities of conquest, minimize indigenous agency, and present European powers in a favorable light. They have had enduring consequences, embedding distorted narratives into education systems, public memory, and international discourse. Understanding these myths is not simply about correcting historical inaccuracies. It's about reclaiming voices, reshaping legacies, and engaging with the truth in a way that fosters justice and awareness. Among the most pervasive of these myths are the noble savage stereotype, the myth of European superiority, and the romanticized notion of discovery that continues to frame the colonial past. The idea of the noble savage emerged early in European accounts of the Americas and became a deeply influential stereotype. This term, though not always used explicitly, reflected the tendency to depict indigenous peoples as either pure and innocent children of nature or as barbaric, uncivilized threats to European order. Both portrayals were simplistic, dehumanizing, and misleading. The noble savage trope idealized indigenous peoples as uncorrupted by civilization, living in harmony with nature but incapable of progress. It implied that they were frozen in time, without history, culture, or political sophistication. This romanticized view masked the complexity of indigenous societies, which had their own intellectual traditions, technological innovations, and dynamic political systems. Civilizations like the Maya, Aztec, and Inca had developed advanced astronomy, architecture, and governance structures, while smaller groups also exhibited rich cultural practices and intercommunal diplomacy. The portrayal of indigenous peoples as simple or naive served a political function. It rendered them passive subjects in need of European guidance or protection, making colonization seem benevolent rather than oppressive. On the flip side, when indigenous groups resisted colonization or failed to conform to European expectations, the narrative often flipped from noble to savage. Resistance was labeled as irrational violence, and indigenous leaders were painted as cruel or fanatical. This dualism allowed colonizers to justify both policies of paternalism and policies of extermination. For instance, religious missions framed their work as civilizing efforts, while military campaigns rationalized brutal suppression of uprisings as necessary acts of defense against barbarity. These stereotypes also found their way into law and policy. European legal frameworks often defined indigenous peoples as wards of the state or subjects of the crown who lacked full human rights. In the Spanish colonies, debates over indigenous humanity led to temporary legal reforms like the New Laws of 1542, but even these were inconsistently enforced and eventually rolled back. In North America, English and later American settlers used similar logic to rationalize the dispossession of native lands, treaties made in bad faith, and forced removals such as the Trail of Tears. Closely tied to these depictions was the myth of European superiority, a belief system that underpinned the entire colonial project. This myth suggested that European societies were inherently more advanced in technology, governance, morality, and religion. It ignored or downplayed indigenous achievements and portrayed colonization as a natural, even righteous, extension of human progress. Europeans imagined themselves as torchbearers of civilization, bringing light to a supposedly dark and undeveloped world. In reality, the technological gap between Europe and the Americas was not as vast as often portrayed. While Europeans had steel weaponry, firearms, and sailing ships, indigenous peoples had developed impressive tools, knowledge of agriculture, environmental engineering, and complex road and communication networks, especially in the Andes and Mesoamerica. Moreover, indigenous people quickly adapted European technologies, incorporating them into their own strategies of resistance and survival. Horses, for instance, transformed the cultures of many plains tribes in North America, turning them into formidable equestrian societies. The myth of superiority also extended to religion and culture. European Christianity was deemed universally superior to indigenous spiritual beliefs, leading to widespread campaigns of conversion, destruction of sacred sites, and erasure of native religious traditions. Yet, many indigenous communities responded not with passive acceptance, but with hybridization, merging Christian symbols with their own cosmologies to create rich syncretic religions that defied easy categorization. Similarly, indigenous art, music, and language persisted in the face of efforts to suppress them, often blending European influences in ways that testified to cultural resilience rather than inferiority. The idea of innate European military superiority has also been exaggerated. Early Spanish conquests, such as those led by Cortés and Pizarro, were as much a result of internal divisions among indigenous groups, strategic alliances, and the catastrophic impact of disease as they were of superior weaponry. In many cases, indigenous resistance lasted for decades or even centuries, as in the Mapuche resistance in Chile, which defied Spanish conquest until the 19th century. These prolonged struggles challenge the narrative of effortless domination and remind us that colonization was contested at every stage. Perhaps the most deeply ingrained myth of colonization is the notion of discovery. From textbooks to national holidays like Columbus Day, the idea that Europeans discovered the Americas has long been accepted as historical fact. Yet this concept erases the existence of the millions of people already living on the continents, many in complex urban civilizations with rich histories. Framing 1492 as a moment of discovery centers the European experience and renders indigenous peoples invisible or marginal. The use of the word discovery is not merely a linguistic quibble. It reflects a worldview that sees Europe as the standard against which all other societies are measured. It implies that the Americas only entered history when Europeans arrived, and that everything that came before was prelude. In contrast, many scholars and indigenous activists argue that the events of 1492 and beyond should be understood as invasions, encounters, or contact zones, terms that more accurately reflect the power dynamics and human costs involved. Modern historiography has begun to challenge these narratives, but they persist in popular culture, education, and public monuments. Textbooks still often emphasize European explorers while giving limited attention to indigenous perspectives. Monuments to figures like Columbus and conquistadors still stand in many cities, though they have become flashpoints for protest and re-evaluation. The debate over terms like discovery versus invasion is not just academic, it speaks to how societies remember, whom they honor, and what values they choose to uphold. In recent years, a growing movement has sought to decolonize historical narratives by amplifying indigenous voices, revising school curricula, and rethinking national holidays. This work involves not only correcting facts but also dismantling the underlying assumptions that have shaped historical storytelling. It means recognizing that colonization was not a unilinear story of progress, but a contested, often violent process that reshaped both the colonizers and the colonized in ways still felt today. In confronting these myths, we gain a clearer picture of the past and a better foundation for building more inclusive and truthful historical narratives. Myths like the noble savage, the illusion of European superiority, and the fiction of discovery are not just relics. They continue to influence how societies see themselves and each other. By unpacking these narratives and examining their origins and effects, we move closer to a history that is shared, not imposed, complex, not simplified, and above all, honest. The realities of colonization in the Americas were marked not only by conquest and settlement but by deeply transformative and often devastating changes to the very fabric of indigenous life. While myths offered simplified or glorified interpretations of these processes, the actual effects of colonization reveal a complex and often brutal history. Disease, forced labor, environmental degradation, cultural imposition, and armed resistance were all integral to the colonial experience. Far from being passive victims, indigenous peoples adapted, resisted, and endured, often preserving aspects of their identity through creative means. By exploring these realities, we can gain a clearer understanding of the profound and lasting consequences that colonization had on the Americas and the world. One of the most immediate and catastrophic consequences of European colonization was the outbreak and rapid spread of infectious diseases. When Europeans first arrived in the Americas, they brought with them pathogens to which indigenous populations had no immunity. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, and later yellow fever swept through native communities with terrifying speed and lethal efficiency. Unlike war or famine, these diseases killed silently and indiscriminately, often wiping out entire villages before any direct contact with Europeans had occurred. This demographic collapse is known as the Great Dying. Estimates vary, but it is widely believed that between 50% and 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas perished in the first century after contact. In densely populated areas like the Valley of Mexico or the Andes, the death toll was particularly catastrophic. The social consequences were immense. leaders died, oral traditions were disrupted, and communities lost the ability to resist or adapt to colonial incursions effectively. The psychological trauma of these losses cannot be overstated. In many cases, indigenous peoples interpreted the epidemics as spiritual punishment or divine judgment, compounding the sense of disorientation and despair. This massive depopulation helped facilitate European conquest. With so many communities weakened or abandoned, colonial powers found it easier to establish settlements, claim land, and impose systems of control. However, Europeans often misunderstood or willfully ignored the role of disease, attributing their success to divine favor or cultural superiority, which in turn reinforced colonial ideologies. Alongside disease, forced labor systems became a cornerstone of colonial economies. In the Spanish colonies, systems like the encomienda and later the repartimiento were established to extract labor from indigenous communities. Under the encomienda system, Spanish colonists were granted rights to indigenous labor in exchange for promises of protection and Christianization. In practice, it resembled a form of feudal slavery, with brutal conditions and widespread abuse. Although the Spanish crown eventually reformed or abolished the encomienda system, it was replaced by the similarly exploitative repartimiento and mita systems, which continued forced labor under a more bureaucratic guise. As indigenous populations declined, colonial powers increasingly turned to Africa to meet labor demands. Thus began the transatlantic slave trade, one of the most tragic and enduring legacies of colonization. Millions of Africans were captured, sold, and transported to the Americas in brutal conditions, with many dying during the Middle Passage. Once in the New World, they were subjected to a lifetime of enslavement on plantations, in mines, or as domestic workers. In colonies like Brazil and the Caribbean, African slaves became the backbone of the economy, particularly in sugar production. The African diaspora reshaped the cultural and demographic landscape of the Americas. Despite the horrors of slavery, African communities preserved elements of their heritage, language, religion, music, cuisine, blending them with indigenous and European influences to create new hybrid cultures. Yet the legacy of racialized slavery endured in the form of systemic inequality, color hierarchies, and ongoing discrimination that persisted long after formal abolition. Environmental and cultural changes accompanied these demographic and labor shifts. The introduction of European agricultural practices transformed landscapes across the Americas. Forests were cleared for plantations, native crops were replaced with European staples, and large-scale monoculture became common. Colonial cities were often built on top of indigenous ones, with European-style grid layouts, churches, and administrative buildings imposing new spatial orders. The cultural imposition went beyond physical transformation. Colonizers sought to eradicate indigenous belief systems and replace them with Christianity. Missionary efforts, sometimes peaceful, sometimes coercive, led to the destruction of temples, sacred texts, and spiritual traditions. European languages, especially Spanish, Portuguese, French, and English, were enforced in schools, courts, and government. Indigenous languages were discouraged or banned, leading to their gradual decline or extinction in many areas. Education was used as a tool of cultural assimilation. Mission schools and colonial institutions taught European history, values, and religion while demeaning indigenous knowledge and traditions. Over generations, these practices eroded cultural continuity, though they were often met with quiet resistance or creative adaptation. Many indigenous peoples found ways to blend Christian and traditional beliefs, developing syncretic faiths that preserved aspects of their ancestral spirituality. Despite the overwhelming pressures of colonization, indigenous resistance was persistent and varied. It took many forms, from armed revolts to everyday acts of defiance and cultural survival. One of the most notable examples was the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 in present-day New Mexico. Led by a Tewa religious leader named Pope, the Pueblo people coordinated a successful uprising against Spanish rule, driving them out of the region for over a decade. The revolt was not only a military victory but also a powerful statement of indigenous sovereignty and identity. Another significant uprising was the rebellion led by Tupac Amaru II in the 18th century Andes. Claiming descent from the Inca royal family, Tupac Amaru II mobilized indigenous and mestizo populations in a widespread revolt against Spanish colonial authorities. Though the rebellion was ultimately crushed and its leader executed, it left a lasting impact and inspired later independence movements in Latin America. Resistance also took the form of cultural resilience. Indigenous communities maintained their languages, rituals, and social structures, even under conditions of extreme repression. They told their stories through oral traditions, wove symbolic meaning into textiles, adapted Christian saints into native cosmologies, and passed down survival strategies through generations. Hybrid identities emerged, not as signs of loss, but as evidence of adaptation and continuity. The survival of indigenous cultures into the present day is a testament to this resilience. In countries like Mexico, Peru, Bolivia, and Guatemala, indigenous peoples remain a vital part of national identity, even as they continue to struggle for rights and recognition. In North America, First Nations, Native American tribes, and Inuit communities assert sovereignty, protect land rights, and revive endangered languages. The endurance of these communities challenges narratives of extinction and disappearance that often accompany colonial histories. Taken together, the realities of colonization reveal a far more complex and painful story than traditional narratives suggest. The Americas were not empty lands awaiting discovery, but vibrant, diverse worlds irrevocably changed by foreign incursion. Colonization brought about demographic disaster, widespread exploitation, environmental transformation, and cultural upheaval, but also provoked resistance, adaptation, and the enduring assertion of indigenous presence. Understanding these realities is crucial not only for historical accuracy but for contemporary conversations about justice, memory, and the ongoing legacies of empire. The long-term impacts and legacies of the colonization of the Americas are as far-reaching as they are complex. They are embedded in the political systems that govern nations, the economic inequalities that persist across continents, the languages spoken, the religions practiced, and the way history itself is written and remembered. Colonization was not a momentary disruption but a transformative historical process whose repercussions are still visible today. By examining the political, cultural, economic, and historiographical consequences, we begin to understand how the colonial past continues to shape the global present. One of the most enduring effects of colonization was the establishment of political structures designed to extract resources and maintain centralized control. Colonial administrations, whether Spanish, Portuguese, French, English, or Dutch, imposed bureaucratic systems that often mirrored the authoritarian nature of European monarchies. Viceroys, governors, and colonial councils ruled vast territories with little input from the local population, especially indigenous communities. These centralized systems discouraged local autonomy and civic participation, embedding a pattern of top-down governance that persisted even after independence. In many cases, these colonial models served as the blueprint for modern nation-states. After gaining independence in the 18th and 19th centuries, Latin American and Caribbean countries often retained the colonial administrative divisions, judicial structures, and patterns of elite control. Power remained concentrated in capital cities, rural regions were marginalized, and indigenous and Afro-descendant populations were frequently excluded from political processes. The result was a legacy of weak democratic institutions, centralized authority, and enduring social inequality. Economically, colonization initiated a massive reorganization of global trade and production. Wealth was extracted from the Americas on an unprecedented scale: gold and silver from mines in Mexico and Peru, sugar and coffee from plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean, tobacco and cotton from North America. This wealth flowed back to Europe, fueling the rise of mercantilism, banking, and eventually the Industrial Revolution. Colonization created what historians call the Atlantic world, a triangular trade system connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a cycle of labor, goods, and capital. The global economy that emerged from colonization was profoundly unequal. Colonies existed primarily to benefit the metropoles, and local development was subordinated to the needs of European markets. Infrastructure was designed to move goods to ports, not to serve local communities. This export-oriented model persisted into the post-colonial era, leaving many former colonies dependent on a few primary products and vulnerable to price fluctuations in global markets. Today, many of the economic challenges faced by Latin American and Caribbean nations can be traced back to these colonial patterns of wealth extraction and underdevelopment. Culturally, colonization produced a profound and lasting syncretism, the blending of indigenous, European, and African traditions into new, hybrid forms. Nowhere is this more evident than in language. Spanish and Portuguese became dominant in Latin America, while English and French spread across North America and the Caribbean. Yet indigenous languages persisted and evolved, creating multilingual societies with complex linguistic identities. Quechua, Nahuatl, Guarani, and dozens of other native languages continue to be spoken today, often alongside the colonial tongues. Religion also underwent significant transformation. Christianity, particularly Catholicism, was a powerful tool of colonization, but it did not erase indigenous spirituality. Instead, a syncretic religious landscape emerged. Saints were equated with pre-Columbian deities. Rituals blended Catholic liturgy with native cosmologies. In the Afro-Caribbean world, religions like Santeria, Vodou, and Candomblé incorporated African spiritual traditions with Christian symbolism. These faiths offered spiritual solace and cultural continuity for enslaved and colonized peoples, and they remain vibrant expressions of identity today. Cuisine, too, reflects the syncretic nature of colonial legacies. The fusion of indigenous ingredients, maize, potatoes, chili peppers, with European staples like wheat, dairy, and meat, and African influences on preparation and seasoning, created entirely new culinary traditions. The arepa in Colombia and Venezuela, the tamale in Mexico, and feijoada in Brazil are all products of this cultural blending. These dishes tell stories of encounter, adaptation, and resistance that go beyond nourishment to express identity and history. The colonial experience also laid the groundwork for modern independence movements and the formation of nation-states. Ironically, the same centralized institutions that oppressed local populations also helped forge a sense of unity and shared identity, eventually fueling demands for self-rule. Revolutionary movements in the Americas, such as those led by Simón Bolívar, José de San Martín, Toussaint Louverture, and George Washington, drew on Enlightenment ideals but also responded directly to the injustices of colonial rule. Yet these movements did not always lead to social transformation. In many countries, independence meant the replacement of European elites with local ones, often of European descent. Deep-rooted inequalities along lines of race, class, and region remained intact. Indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples, who had played critical roles in resistance and rebellion, were frequently sidelined in the new national narratives. The promises of liberation often went unfulfilled for the majority of the population. This disconnect between the ideals of independence and the realities of post-colonial governance contributed to cycles of instability, authoritarianism, and popular protest. In the 20th and 21st centuries, movements for land reform, civil rights, and indigenous sovereignty have continued to challenge the colonial legacies embedded in political and social structures. These ongoing struggles reveal that decolonization is not a completed historical event, but a living process. How colonization is remembered and taught is itself a contested terrain. For much of modern history, dominant narratives celebrated European explorers as heroic adventurers and portrayed colonization as a civilizing mission. Indigenous peoples were either erased or cast as obstacles to progress. School textbooks, public monuments, and national holidays reinforced these myths, shaping generations of historical consciousness. In recent decades, these narratives have been increasingly challenged. Scholars, activists, and indigenous communities have pushed for more inclusive and accurate histories. Debates over statues, such as those of Columbus or conquistadors, reflect a broader reassessment of who gets to be honored in public space. Controversies over holidays like Columbus Day, which has been renamed Indigenous Peoples' Day in several regions, underscore the shift toward acknowledging the violence and injustice of colonization. Historiography, the way history is written, has played a key role in these changes. New approaches emphasize indigenous voices, oral histories, and local perspectives. They challenge Eurocentric frameworks and highlight the agency of colonized peoples. This has led to more nuanced understandings of events like the conquest of Mexico, the Haitian Revolution, or the slave trade, not as linear tales of domination, but as complex, contested encounters. Calls for reparations, land return, and historical justice are also gaining traction. These demands are not simply about the past, but about addressing contemporary inequalities that have colonial roots. Whether in the form of official apologies, educational reforms, or material compensation, they aim to reckon with history in ways that promote healing and equity. Ultimately, the legacy of colonization in the Americas is not a single story but a mosaic of experiences and consequences. It includes the rise and fall of empires, the blending of cultures, the resilience of communities, and the enduring struggle for justice. Understanding this legacy requires not only studying the past but listening to the present, hearing the voices of those whose lives have been shaped by centuries of colonial entanglement. Only then can we begin to move toward a more honest and inclusive historical consciousness. The colonization of the Americas remains one of the most significant and far-reaching processes in world history. From the first voyages of European explorers to the long shadow cast by colonial structures on present-day societies, the story of colonization is complex, multifaceted, and deeply consequential. This study has traced the development of this process from pre-Columbian civilizations through early European contact, colonial conquest and administration, the myths that shaped perception, the harsh realities experienced by millions, and the enduring legacies that continue to influence political, cultural, and social life in the Americas and beyond. At its core, the colonization of the Americas was driven by a confluence of motivations, economic ambition, religious zeal, and political competition. The arrival of Europeans disrupted vast and diverse indigenous civilizations such as the Aztec, Maya, Inca, and Mississippian cultures, whose sophisticated societies had thrived for centuries. Colonization was not merely the result of superior weaponry or European ingenuity, but of a series of interlinked factors including disease, coercive labor systems, and strategic manipulation of local divisions. The myths surrounding colonization, particularly the portrayals of European benevolence, discovery, and cultural superiority, have long obscured the realities of conquest, exploitation, and resistance. The romanticized image of the noble explorer or the helpless indigenous person served to justify systems of domination. These narratives continue to influence public memory and education, often sidelining the voices and perspectives of those most affected by colonization. By closely examining both myths and realities, we uncover a much richer and more honest portrayal of the colonial era. This includes recognizing the brutal systems of forced labor, slavery, and displacement, the devastating demographic collapse due to introduced diseases, the cultural erasure and imposed religious and linguistic changes, and the resilience, adaptation, and survival of indigenous and Afro-descendant communities. Resistance was not rare or marginal. It was widespread, diverse, and persistent, whether through open revolt or cultural preservation. Furthermore, the structures established during colonization, centralized administration, extractive economies, racial hierarchies, did not vanish with independence. They were often absorbed into the nation-state frameworks that emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries. Thus, the inequalities, exclusions, and power imbalances rooted in colonial rule continue to shape modern societies. The call for land rights, cultural recognition, and economic justice by indigenous and marginalized communities is part of an ongoing struggle to decolonize not only systems but also collective memory. Understanding the historical truth of colonization is not an academic exercise alone. It is a moral and cultural imperative. History is not static. It is shaped by the questions we ask and the voices we amplify. Reassessing the myths of colonization and replacing them with inclusive, evidence-based narratives allows societies to confront past injustices and build more equitable futures. It also expands the scope of what history includes, inviting indigenous, Afro-descendant, and other historically silenced perspectives into the mainstream. Inclusive histories are not just about adding different viewpoints, they are about fundamentally rethinking the lens through which we view the past. This involves recognizing indigenous knowledge systems, oral traditions, and cultural expressions as valid sources of historical understanding. It requires questioning dominant narratives and being open to discomfort, complexity, and contradiction. Only by doing so can we appreciate the full human experience of the Americas and the world systems that developed in their wake. As contemporary societies grapple with issues of identity, inequality, and historical justice, the lessons of colonization remain urgent and instructive. Acknowledging the wounds of the past and the strength of those who survived them is a step toward reconciliation and understanding. By moving beyond the myths and embracing the realities, we not only honor the truth but also empower future generations to see history not as a story written by victors, but as a shared narrative still unfolding. In conclusion, the colonization of the Americas was not a single story, but a series of interconnected, often conflicting, historical processes that reshaped the world. Its legacies, both devastating and transformative, are still with us. By studying these legacies with honesty, empathy, and a commitment to inclusivity, we can forge a more complete and compassionate understanding of our shared past. This understanding, in turn, offers the foundation for a more just and informed future.